Welcome to our 10th annual Police Accountability Forum. I am Gordon Waldron. I'm with the Chicago Council of Lawyers, which is co-sponsoring this forum with the Appleseed Fund for Justice and the American Constitution Society. The president of the Chicago Council of Lawyers is Matt Daniels, and our executive director is Malcolm Rich, who is here somewhere. The co-chairpersons of our Civil Liberties Committee are Dave Melton, Carl Royal, who is sitting in the middle there, and myself. Our committee is always looking for new members. If interested, you may call me at 708-400-1915. I want to thank Latham & Watkins, LLP, for hosting this forum, and the American Constitution Society for helping to publicize it. We have 3 speakers today. I have asked each to limit his remarks to a maximum of 10 to 15 minutes so that we have plenty of time for questions. Our first speaker is Guian Foreman, president of the Chicago Police Board. He is also the executive director of the Greater Southwest Development Corporation. The police board holds hearings when the police superintendent seeks to discharge a police officer or to suspend an officer for more than 30 days if that officer asks for a hearing. Our second speaker is Joseph Ferguson, who has been the Chicago Inspector General since 2009. The Inspector General has the power to investigate the performance of governmental officers, employees, and programs in order to detect and prevent misconduct, inefficiency, and waste. Joseph Ferguson has also served for 15 years in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Chicago, and he was a member of the Mayor's Police Accountability Task Force. He has recently nominated, and the City Council has recently approved, Joseph Lipari to be the next Deputy Inspector General for Public Safety. Before he speaks, Joseph Ferguson will introduce Mr. Lipari. Our third speaker is Jamie Calvin, a writer and human rights activist. A lawsuit he filed several years ago established that police discipline records are public records. An organization he founded has since posted many of those online. We had also invited to speak the Chief Administrator of the Civilian Office of Police Accountability, called COPA, and the Director of Training for the Chicago Police Department. Neither were able to speak at this forum. If you have signed up for CLE credit, at the end of the forum, please complete and return to the front desk, or the desk that's out there, the CLE evaluation form, and pick up your attendance certificate. Being a police officer is a dangerous job. Recall that Commander Paul Bauer was shot and killed in February while trying to arrest a suspect carrying a gun in the loop. Most officers perform their jobs honorably, but a few engage in misconduct and some engage in obstruction of justice. The process for investigating complaints alleging police conduct must be fair, transparent, and prompt. President Foreman, you are our first speaker. You may come up here or to the table wherever you wish.
I attended one of these a couple of years ago, but I was in the audience watching Max, so it's a little bit different sitting in this chair. So thank you very much. As Gordon just described, the Chicago Police Board is an independent civilian body that decides disciplinary cases involving Chicago police officers. Cases come to the police board one of 2 ways. They either come through the superintendent's office via the Bureau of Internal Affairs, or they come through the superintendent's office through COPA. Those are the two methods. The responsibility, Civilian Office of Police Accountability, the police department, and the police board have different roles. The responsibility to receive complaints rests with COPA. Depending on the nature of those allegations, either COPA or the police department's BIA will investigate them. The police board's role is to decide those disciplinary matters that are filed. The board is comprised of 9 board members who are appointed by the mayor with advice and consent from the City Council of Chicago. On the board, the composition is 5 men and 4 women, 3 African American, 4 white, 2 Hispanic, all with varying backgrounds. Some are lawyers, some have law enforcement backgrounds, others don't. The role of the police board in the disciplinary process. The board handles 2 types of cases. One, resolve matters in which the chief administrator of COPA and the superintendent do not agree on the prospective discipline. So COPA says the punishment should be X, the superintendent thinks it should be Y. They talk, they cannot come to an agreement, then there's a role for the police board to step in. Now I'll get to a little bit more of those details in a second. The second is disciplinary cases when the superintendent files charges directly with us, and it's either to suspend an officer for more than 30 days all the way up to discharge. So in the cases that I just kind of talked about where there's a disagreement between the superintendent's office and COPA, when a disagreement arises between COPA and the superintendent's office, then there's another route that it takes for the police board to make a decision. There's one member on the board who gets the evidence from both sides and make a decision, not of guilt or innocence, but whether or not the superintendent overcame COPA's recommendation. You guys are lawyers, so I'm going to go into a little more detail than what I thought about earlier today. So the current process is one board member reviews this information. This is a recent change. Prior to this, it was 3 board members, okay? Now, why did we make the decision to go from 3 to 1? Well, number one, we were down 2 board members. We had absent seats, 2 board members, right? So that leaves 7 people to make a decision on the case. And then 3 board members are pulled off to review a case because you get information before the rest of the board sees it. So now, this could be a very serious case. There could only be 4 people that could make that decision. It's really tough. You don't get the expertise of the other members of the board. You don't get both their legal expertise as well as their expertise, their experiences from the city. So we made a recommendation, talked it over with the police department, with COPA, with city council, mayor's office, and we made the decision to move to 1. It doesn't make it any easier when you finally get that case. It's better than having 4, but 6 is still a really tough one because, not 6, I'm sorry, 8, because you can still end at a time. So it's still a tough situation, but these are the situations that we have. So there are a couple of popular cases I'm sure that you guys have read about in the news where this is the actual situation. So when we do have that one member making the decision, if it goes to the full board, if the superintendent has the burden to overcome the chief administrator, the chief administrator's recommendation. If the recommendation is to discharge the officer from the Chicago Police Department, the case is to be filed for hearing and consideration by the full police. If he does meet his burden or her burden, the superintendent's response should be implemented. So in a case where COPA recommended X, the superintendent recommends Y, that one member says the superintendent overcame the burden, the punishment that should be imposed is Y, the recommendation of that of the superintendent. That one member must recuse themselves when the case, if the case goes to the full board, because they got information at a different time than the rest of the board. So in the case of trying to be fully transparent, making sure that all the board members got the same information at the same time, that board member must recuse themselves. In the discharge cases, the police board decides, these are the most serious cases. The role of the police board is to be an impartial decision maker that makes decisions based on the evidence that's made part of the record at the disciplinary hearing. Only evidence that's presented at the disciplinary hearing. All of the board's disciplinary hearings are open to the public. Both the superintendent and the accused officer have a right to due process. At the hearing, they have a right to present evidence and to cross-examine witnesses. The board takes all final action on cases in the public at its monthly meeting, where each board member's vote is announced and recorded. And finally, the board posts on its website its written decisions, which include detailed explanations of the reasons for the board's findings. So, thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Delighted to be here, and always grateful and admiring of the work of the Chicago Council of Lawyers in sort of keeping in public consciousness critical issues, not just the legal community, but the community at large. So thank you very much. So I want to give a little bit more of the context and backdrop for what Dion was just speaking to with respect to the police board. We have a very, very complex structural landscape right now that we are still in sort of fluid circumstance and edging into with respect to police accountability. To date, acting on the recommendations of the Police Accountability Task Force and the Justice Department, there are a few pieces that are in place. So, the Chicago Police Department protects and serves. There are two bodies that investigate: the Bureau of Internal Affairs of the Chicago Police Department and the Civilian Office of Police Accountability. The Civilian Office of Police Accountability basically being the successor to an earlier body referred to as IPRA, the Independent Police Review Authority. And the difference between the Bureau of Internal Affairs and COPA has mostly to do with primary jurisdiction for specific types of misconduct. With respect to COPA and its predecessor IPRA, what it is uniquely and singly charged with investigating are some of the most serious infractions or alleged infractions, particularly involving use of force. Right? And there's myriad forms of use of force for which COPA is the primary, if not sole, investigative authority. There are a number of other things which, in sort of the recent legislation, I think it was October of 2016, legislation passed creating COPA. There are some other things that it has been given primary responsibility for, certain types of Fourth Amendment violations, particularly relating to search and seizure, other types of police misconduct that actually touch upon either behavioral or field operational issues that actually connect up to concerns involving officers' suitability for use of force. And I won't go into all of those, but understand that they are the primary investigative organization for those types of things. They're separate and apart from the police department. They are independent. They're standalone, especially with the legislation that was passed in October of 2016. Bureau of Internal Affairs handles just about everything else. And that could be really mine run stuff, minor infractions of general orders and other types of orders of the police department, violation of all sorts of practices. But then there's also a component of it that actually investigates corruption, sort of confidential investigations that go to issues of corruption. That is internal to the police department. And as it evolves, how sort of integrated with the department as a whole is something that probably is going to be the topic of further discussion. It's certainly something our office is looking at. So first, again, police department, serve and protect. BIA and COPA investigate, disciplinary investigations, occasionally criminal investigations of officers with their jurisdiction specifically divided up between them, subject matter jurisdiction. All right, next part of the system, the police board. As Guillaume just sort of set forth, they are the adjudicators. And he explained with respect to more serious infractions, the findings of those investigative bodies go to the superintendent's office. The superintendent assesses recommendations that are made and the findings that are made with the benefit of the full evidentiary record, and makes a determination as to whether charges should be brought against the officer. The more serious of those resulting in suspensions proposed of greater than 30 days or involving terminations, those are matters within the adjudicative jurisdiction of the police board. Everything else goes to sort of internal sort of disciplinary enforcement processes of the department itself. All right, so again, protect and serve, investigate, adjudication as to certain more serious matters. And then finally, there's the Inspector General's office, okay? And a specific component of the Inspector General's office. And as Gordon in his introductory remarks noted, the Inspector General's office has this plenary jurisdiction over the city as a whole, both investigative and sort of audit and review authority over all of city operations. Historically, the Inspector General's office, until about 6 or 7 years ago, had no involvement with the police department, okay? And in the early 2010s, and there was a reason for that. And the reason was there was a separate sort of collateral system set up for the police department, one, and two, the Chicago Police Department, like big municipal police departments, basically operated long in sort of fortress kind of structure and culture. So they were over there, and the IG's office was never contemplated as actually exercising its plenary jurisdiction over the department itself. But because of things that we started to see and the fact that we had this plenary jurisdiction, we started to strategically step into places, whether it was on the basis of specific investigations or certain types of audits to work our way into the police department. All of that got put into overdrive at the point in time that the Laquan McDonald video was released, triggering the creation of the Police Accountability Task Force, the Justice Department Pattern and Practice Review, and the creation of a dedicated Inspector General function for the police department within the Office of Inspector General. So that's the prompt for my introduction of Joey Lapari, who is sitting up front here, who was just confirmed by the City Council as the Deputy Public Safety Inspector General. That's a mouthful of a title. Basically, he's the police IG. So, and what is he stepping into and taking over? He's stepping into and taking over a dedicated unit, and by dedicated I mean a unit that is solely given over exclusively to oversight of the police department and the police accountability function. So that's everything that I just named before: CPD, BIA component of CPD, COPA, and the police board. And I like Ian, and we work well together, but there's this oversight thing that we have to do with respect to, with respect to the police board as well. And so what does that component actually do? So there's about 20 people doing oversight work of a different, a couple of different varieties. One is what we call the evaluations unit, and they are basically doing audit or audit-based reviews of operations of all of those agency components that I just named. It could be administrative, it could be field operational, it could go to policy, practices, procedures, and I'll give you a couple of examples of what we have going on right now in the first generation of work. The other part of what it does is by mandate under the ordinance, it is supposed to look at investigations, disciplinary investigations that are being conducted by BIA and by COPA to determine whether or not they are being done right, whether or not there are any material deficiencies in them, whether as a matter of process or substantive development of evidence, and basically to determine whether or not those agencies are doing what they're supposed to be doing. Some examples of what we are doing in the sort of the broader operational audit or evaluation realm in the first generation of products that we are working towards is a review of CPD's gang database, or so-called gang database. Okay? The gang database is not a single thing. It is a composite of things that nobody really knows. There is great mystery around it. Publicly, no one knows how it's constituted, what it's used for, and so on and so forth. So one example of something that we're working up and we'll report publicly. An example of how we examine different parts of this overall system resides in two reports that we've actually issued, one that's gone public and one that we're waiting for the superintendent's office to respond to. We did a report a couple of months ago about the department's compliance with Firearm Owner Identification Act in the state of Illinois. And what we found was arrests that were made in situations that resulted in the recovery or the taking of a firearm were not put through the required procedures and resulted in the return of firearms to people without, in situations where there was substantial basis to believe that either the individual or the public would be put at risk by returning the firearm to the individual. So that goes directly to sort of law enforcement objectives and public safety objectives, right? The other side of it, of sort of this loose ledger that I'm sort of putting forward, sitting on the superintendent's report is a review of the department's management of school resource officers, about which we've heard a great deal in the community, and whether or not it comports with best practices nationally. I won't leave it as an elephant in the room. It doesn't comport with best practices nationally. And the way that things work here is, by law, the superintendent's office must respond. CPD must respond to the findings, must respond to the recommendations. Where there's differences of opinion, that triggers a public hearing. The Public Safety Committee of the City Council, which will sort of draw the City Council into a form of oversight engagement that maybe we're not used to in this city, but it's required expressly by law. But there, we're talking about something that sort of goes to kind of inside baseball, internal operations of the department, that really the way that it is lived and breathed in the community is undermining of community confidence and trust in the department, okay? So different aspects all being done under the rubric of the Public Safety Inspector General. A couple of other things that it does. It has a community outreach component to it, and so we're very, very actively and forward deployed in the community around a number of these projects. We've held community conversations hosted by community organizations to get the community's input on things of matter and interest to them. And another thing coming forth on August 20th is an information portal, where the City of Chicago, for the first time in public user-friendly fashion, will be putting forward information that will tell you about the composition of the police department at the district level, at a position level, at a neighborhood level, at a department level. Lots of other information about the city, the police department, things like the complaint and disciplinary sort of registers of officers, something that I believe that Mr. Calvin will talk about very briefly. And other things that are sort of ongoing operational stuff, like independent stop reports, which is the subject of a memorandum of agreement right now between the ACLU and the city, with information going to former magistrate judge Arlander Keys for periodic evaluation and assessment. You'll be able to see on the Inspector General website pretty close to real-time information, refreshing every 24 hours, both about composition of the force and actual operational realms, okay? And it will be on a Tableau platform that will allow the public to actually change the filters and do its own form of analysis. So we're very excited about it. It's a different form of transparency, which will allow for a different form of engagement by the public that won't involve chasing around FOIAs and FOIA litigation, which maybe Mr. Calvin will also be speaking about in a minute. So anyway, transparency, accountability, but that's our office, that's the system. We're just underway, and you can look forward to a lot of work coming from us, led by and spoken through the voice of Mr. Lipari, who is returning to Chicago after a most recent stint in the NYPD IG's office, which, like Chicago, is a dedicated component within its Inspector General equivalent, a dedicated unit within an independent Inspector General office. He was an Assistant Inspector General there. Before that, he was the Executive Director of the Syracuse Civilian Review Board, which was this sort of all-powerful but non-used oversight component in Syracuse. where he sort of stood in the position of sort of being a one-man sort of entrepreneurial standing up of something that nobody wanted to have happen. So he's lived in this space, but he's lived in this space before because he went to graduate school at the University of Illinois, Chicago, the Circle campus, and has been involved with a number of things that I think make him familiar with people who are in the room here, and I know that he's very excited about being back in Chicago and connected up with all of you. I'll stop there.
So I appreciate Joe's preview of my remarks. I speak from the perspective of civil society, and I think the sort of map that Gian and Joe have given of the institutional landscape has another critical dimension, critical in terms of how we got here in the struggle for police accountability, and critical going forward. I think we're at a kind of inflection point, a watershed right now. You know, I think most people in this room are aware of a number of sort of parallel developments in the city that I think taken together create a moment, a kind of defining moment for the city, for its leadership, but for all of us, that bears comparison to the period immediately after the Laquan McDonald implosion. You know, this extended period of such intensity, moral awakening, sense of consequences, sense of intolerable conditions that absolutely needed to be addressed. 3.5 years later, we're at a moment where the trial of Officer Jason Van Dyke is in the offing, scheduled for September 5th, but even with slippage, it will be coming soon. The consent decree draft landed the end of July. We're in the comment period, but we will surely be discussing it long beyond the comment period. The mayor's race, I think the date of the election is late February, and a runoff, which will probably occur, would be early April, but it feels like it's all ramping up, and we have a mayor's race in which the incumbent is challenged, among others, by his former police superintendent and by Lori Lightfoot, who was in Gian's position at the head of the police board and was the mayor's choice to head the Police Accountability Task Force that Joe was also a member of. Then there's the Fraternal Order of Police without a union contract, which is probably a state of affairs that will continue for some time in a posture of complete obstruction of any kind of reform. These converging events, you know, fast-moving converging events, I think create a period where, as a city, we are going to be engaged in really robust, ongoing debate about police accountability, which means debate about fundamental issues of racial justice in the city. And a great deal hinges on the quality of that debate. You know, I think that, again, speaking from the point of view of civil society, police reform necessarily involves democratic renewal. If we can't get better at having necessary arguments with each other about fundamental human rights issues, then we're not going to realize an extraordinary opportunity I actually never expected to see in my lifetime. An opportunity for fundamental change, for engaging foundational issues in American life with respect to race. So there's a lot at stake that's happening right now, and it's tremendously encouraging. You know, whatever the limitations, imperfections, weaknesses of the consent decree, and people are pouring through it from multiple perspectives, trying to assess it. This is a big deal. It's a watershed. It's a big deal, and it creates a vehicle and I think of it as a kind of institutionalization of reform. I think Joe early in his remarks alluded to, he and I have had this conversation in the past. There are these, I don't want to suggest that there hasn't been progress, some substantial progress over these last years. There has been, but it's sometimes felt like a sort of flotilla of ships in becalmed water. It hasn't been coordinated. And now, with the consent decree, the soon-to-be appointed police monitor, federal oversight, the emerging landscape that Joe described, the possibility of something that has more coordination and really a better use of sort of common resources towards common ends, it seems plausible. So it's a kind of institutionalization of the reform process. And I think a critical consideration, and it would have been true and a matter of concern had the catastrophe not happened at the national level and had the DOJ gone forward as anticipated with the consent decree. I think there's a danger of that with the institutionalization of reform, that civil society energies will be sort of sidelined. Like the institutions, the professionals, now have this in hand. We can kind of go home. And I think that would be a terrible outcome. This is fundamentally a political process of Chicagoans and their neighbors and their institutions. And we've got a lot of work to do in that vein. We have multiple vehicles now. But if there's that kind of derailing of community energies, and if we treat this as police reform as sort of a matter of a kind of bureaucratic process of fixing the institutions and tweaking the procedures, then we will have missed an extraordinary opportunity. Some positive things will come of that, but we will have missed an extraordinary opportunity. And I did an interview just before we convened here and was asked about the low clearance rate of the police on homicides and shootings, which is abysmally, appallingly, shockingly low. And I think it is among the measures, among the symptoms of what I've come to think of as a crisis of the civil order in Chicago. Where critical institutions have had their legitimacy cratered, where there is deep distrust, if not alienation, from civil authority in large parts of the city. Where there is a intolerably high homicide rate that we tolerate, a shockingly low clearance rate on homicides that shows no signs of getting better and instead of going down. If that's a valid way of talking, that we've been in a prolonged crisis of the civil order, then I think we should see this occasion, the consent decree, but also the Inspector General for Public Safety, the vehicles that we now have for moving this process forward, as an opportunity to reconstitute, to take steps towards reconstituting the civil order, which is really fundamentally a matter of the relationship that residents of Chicago have to their government and to agents of their government. And so as Joe alluded, I've been involved with a whole range of colleagues, other journalists, and the Civil Rights Bar for a number of years. I think it begins to be a number of decades, so I don't want to think too much about that. And in pushing for transparency within these institutions. And when we started this process, official secrecy reigned completely. And secrecy was a tool of power. a tool for maintaining the official narrative, whether about the individual case, that either of you might be involved in investigating or assessing the investigation of, or the larger narrative of the city, the state of public safety in the city, the well-being of citizens in the city. As a journalist, I work to sort of penetrate official secrecy on individual stories, and for a number of years, particularly in high-rise public housing on the South Side, documented individual cases of abuse by the police. That in that setting, in the last chapter of high-rise public housing, when everybody knew the buildings were coming down, when the population had been criminalized in the public eye, was almost a kind of laboratory for observing police abuse, because really what conferred impunity above all was the social status of victims, people who simply weren't credible and weren't believed. So after several years of documenting and writing about individual cases, and I mean in terms of human rights reporting that looks at the particular blows from particular hands to particular bodies, and is not abstracted up here. It's about the injury and the insult to the dignity of individuals. The question formed, and for me as a journalist and for civil rights lawyers that had begun to work with us, the question formed, and it's still the question that drives my work and the work of my colleagues. What set of, we know that this is happening, we've observed it, we've documented it. What set of institutional conditions would have to be the case for this to be happening? So, we began with the realities on the ground and began to climb an analytic ladder. I won't take you through all the twists and turns of the litigation as much as I would like to, that led in 2014 to a decision in a case in which I was the plaintiff, which has the, to my ear, pleasing title, Calvin versus Chicago, that established really beyond our expectations that in Illinois, police misconduct files belong to the public. Documents buried on police misconduct belong to the public, subject to reasonable redaction. Officer's home address, social security number, but their names above all, the names of other co-accused and witness officers. This is public information. And we have since, I'm sorry, we have since, yeah, sorry about that. We have since, I have an organization, the Invisible Institute, and since then we have taken on the task, as we understand it, of operationalizing transparency. So the court declared a principle. This is public information. The principle is not self-executing. And so what we have done is created something called the Citizens Police Data Project, easy to find, and made a significant investment of time, effort, and resources in building a user-friendly interface for a range of different sets of users. So obviously journalists, lawyers of different stripes, but above all for the general public. And this is an ongoing process. And in a matter of days, we'll be rolling out the 2.0 version of the database. It's immensely gratifying to hear Joe describe what's going to be coming out of the Inspector General's office in terms of transparency. I think it's critical as we go forward that in this unfolding intense period in Chicago, that we continue to press for greater and greater transparency. We now have a situation where the legal principle is established that this material is public, but in fact, we're still dealing with a kind of Rube Goldberg contraption of FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, which is frustrating for those seeking documents and frustrating for those on the other side. I think it's time, and what Joe's describing is a step in that direction, for a real paradigm shift, where government takes an affirmative, proactive stance with respect to transparency, and it isn't necessary for citizens to ask for it, that it is made available. I said before, I'll close with this observation. I said before that if this is a crisis of the civil order, then the opportunity we have is to reconstitute the civil order. Transparency is a big part of that. You know, what we've come to understand and what I think has been demonstrated in the city is making information available is also a redistribution of power. So it's obvious that official secrecy reigns, we are disempowered as citizens, we're disempowered as civil society because we don't have information. And the state has also the rhetorical tool, official secrecy. You know, think Dick Cheney, you know, if you knew what I know, you'd know I was doing the right thing for you. When we do have access to the information, when we have access not just to aggregate numbers, but to the underlying information, can do our own analyses, that's where real accountability can be enforced, but also where citizens can feel in some meaningful form of partnership with government institutions. So, you know, let me end on that note, but I think the role of civil society, the role of the civil rights bar, the role of journalists and activists going forward is critical, as much as these other dimensions of the institutional accountability regime. Thanks for your attention.
We're now going to have the question and answer period, and if you are sitting in the back or have a self-voice, bring a mic to you. I will recognize questionnaires from up here. You can ask them of the panel as a whole or of any particular person, and if you would identify your name and if you want to, your affiliation, and Harold.
We need to make sure that the mic is on and people talk right into it.
Okay.
Hello?
I think that one is on.
Hello? Hello?
Yeah.
All right, I'm Harold Winston with the Cook County Public Defender's Office and the Chicago Collaborative for Police Accountability. We're in the public comment period for the consent decree that ends soon on August 17th. I'd like to ask each of you if there are one or two things, if you've read the draft, that you think should be included in the consent decree that are not there now.
Well, let me answer just reinforcing what I just said. I think a much more robust commitment to transparency. And by that I mean proactive. So not just that people can access information via FOIA, but looking for ways to, I mean, you know, it appears to me on a first reading of the consent decree draft that they are in fact creating fairly robust data gathering tools for internal management purposes. That information, again, subject to reasonable redaction, should be publicly available.
Two categorical things. Metrics for evaluating performance. There are a lot of aspirational agreements of principles, but a whole lot of room for argument over what constitutes the proper metrics for actually assessing success evaluation, which in the context of the consent decree will result in lots and lots of noise and not a lot of signal, and slow the process. And the other thing is a robust commitment, and this somewhat, I think, aligns with what Jamie was getting at, a robust commitment of cyclical reporting around those metrics. Obviously, the monitor is going to be able to request that information, but it's that sort of proactivity, and unfortunately, given the culture that we're trying to overcome, proactivity is something that is going to have to be required, which does not make it very proactive culturally. But that's the place that we really need to start. So a beefing up of metrics and a specification of reporting cycle around a lot of the information is going to allow the public to formulate its own understanding as to whether or not we're making progress. You know, with respect to FOIA and the public's access to information, you know, Jamie is absolutely right, and I know I'm preaching to the choir, but most of the people in the room. Basically, what determines what is made public is what is necessary to end litigation over the bare minimum threshold of what FOIA requires. And what we do need is a paradigm shift and a cultural shift that gets us out of that measure and into a measure that says, what does the public need to know, and what can we provide them that is not otherwise barred or inhibited or constrained by the law.
Okay, this is a tough question. I'm going to answer the question from the perspective of the police board president, and then I'm going to answer it from the perspective of somebody working in the community. So the police board section in the consent decree was relatively small, considering the rest of it. And the police board is absolutely ready, willing, and able to implement those changes. And I don't think that there was anything necessarily that I would change about some of those things. Basically what it boils down to for us is, one, establishing a criteria by which police board members are selected. I think that a part of the feeling maybe in the community is that these are political appointments. Now, I can assure you that in the 8 years that I've been on board, I've never felt any political pressure. But so that the community continues to have some representation in the board and they feel like it's not a board that's in an ivory tower. So that was the first part. Establish the criteria for hearing officers. Our hearing officers are almost like judges in a sense. They run the day-to-day of the hearings that we have. They have to have incredible understanding of both the law, procedures, what works with union contracts, what doesn't, what's acceptable evidence, and that kind of thing. And then the third is a formal training policy for the board. If we're making decisions on appropriate use of force, if we have not had that training ourselves, and we were never police officers, how is it that we can make this decision? And so we have gone through some training, but it's been informal before. This is a tough case for us guys, you know, going forward, let's go get some training, right? But so now it'll be mandated, it'll be regular, it'll be reported. I'm sure Joe is going to make sure that everybody got, same way you guys have to get the CLEs, he's going to make sure that we do our training. And then posting the case-specific data, which is already available on the police board's website. So that's from a police board perspective. From my perspective, as somebody who lives in the community, works in Chicago lawn, West Englewood neighborhoods, I think this is all good, but I think that it's hard for me sometimes to push back against Jamie. I was a high school track star in high school, and I used to run with Jamie back when I was in high school. So I think none of this makes a difference unless we get to the issues of what's happening in our community. We have to build some trust in the community. There has to be, data is great, but if I don't have a job, I'm not going on the website to look to see how many people were arrested. And I know what's going on. I know I have 2 cousins that were killed in drive-by shootings. I know who killed them. Absolutely, I know who killed them. But there's a low clearance rate. And there's a low clearance rate because the community doesn't have that trust with government, with police. And so it's not that we have to reestablish, we have to establish. And it goes beyond just police-community relationships. It goes beyond that. And I think that as a civil society, when we start to think about that, then this document starts to come to life.
Other questions? Yes, right back there.
Speaking just as a non-expert citizen, there's a conventional wisdom that part of what we see is caused by a problem of otherwise good cops protecting bad cops. Is that a myth? Is that a reality? I'd love to hear each of your input on whether that is a thing and whether it's a factor in the problems we have.
Joe is looking at me because I've written a good deal about the so-called code of silence. It's a reality. It's a reality. And, you know, I was once at a conference on institutional accountability across institutions, and there was a professor there from the University of California. This may be a commonplace observation, but it was the first I had heard. He looked at corporate misconduct and corporate accountability, and he said, you know, in any institution, you have maybe 5% of your personnel who are beyond superb, you know, who exemplify the very best of the institution. You can tweak these percentages, but we'll say, you know, 5% who are superb. You have 5% who are beyond worthless, who are criminal, who, you know, do damage to the institution. And the character of the institution will be determined by which way the other 90% orient. And I think what we have in the police department, and it's a long story over a long time, and it kind of metastasized, and now nobody knows quite how to dismantle it, is a culture that is significantly controlled by the 5% who are most abusive, whatever abusive means. You know, racist, corrupt, wretched towards women, get off on physical violence. And so, you know, it's a weird, because of the so-called code, which is a complicated dynamic in that I think, as most things that are destructive and pathological, it arises from recognizable sentiments. We're in the foxhole together. Nobody's more. You're taught in the academy. Nobody's more important than your partner. You know, your bond is with your partner. Nobody likes a tattletale. You know, there are all sorts of things that are kind of human tendencies, and they evolve into something in this setting that is absolutely toxic, hugely damaging for the institution as well as the general public. And I think, curiously, I've had this conversation with officials from the Fraternal Order of Police to no great effect, arguing that we should be shoulder to shoulder, and these are terrible working conditions for police officers. And for me, the most poignant example of that is the Laquan McDonald case, which I know everybody's familiar with. What many people aren't familiar with or have forgotten is there were two officers, the initial responders in that case, who handled it flawlessly. Got a 911 call, a young man with a knife seemingly trying to break into trucks in a deserted area of the Southwest Side, and they came in and they asked him to drop the knife. He refused. They stayed with him. They didn't ratchet up the encounter. There's video footage of them from private surveillance cameras walking with Laquan McDonald, accompanying him. They have all the time in the world. They didn't call for backup. They called to see if somebody had a taser. One of the officers is several strides behind him on the sidewalk, illuminating him with a flashlight. The car is maybe a car length or two behind. They don't know it at the time. Certainly, Laquan McDonald doesn't know it. They're walking him to his death. They're handling the situation exactly as we would want police officers to handle it. They get to 41st and Pulaski. Everything accelerates. Jason Van Dyke jumps out of his car, I think in less than 30 seconds, opens fire. These officers are standing there. There are 2 of 9 officers, none of whom unholster their guns while this barrage of shooting is going on. I have no difficulty imagining that they are appalled by what they witnessed, probably far beyond what we have experienced looking at the video. But I suspect their next thought is, oh my God, now I'm in the middle of this mess. now I'm in the middle of this mess. They know, as a matter of their de facto job description, that they're going to be required to give an account of what happened that justifies what happened. Joe probably has a better up-to-date knowledge of the fate of those officers, but they've faced loss of their jobs and the possibility of criminal sanctions. Can you imagine worse working conditions than that? So, but that is the reality. That is the reality. And somebody once said, I think, in the context of totalitarianism, that an institution where you have to be heroic to behave decently is, and that's what the police, to do your job, behave decently, you have to be heroic to the point of martyrdom right now.
And I'm not going to answer your question directly, because there's a lot of litigation around that question. But I will say this, from an oversight perspective, from a reform moment perspective. Historically, we haven't created the systems and the mechanisms to make it possible to do the right thing without being a hero. So, some examples of that, and I think Jamie's remarks are especially well taken in the connect up to just the human element of all of this. We're talking about people with families and lives who need their jobs, many of whom are very young, still very impressionable in many ways, are influenced easily by the organization which they're part of. But some things at the front end. Are we training and acculturating officers from the academy and as they move into the field during their PPO period to actually see the communities that they are working in and serving from a human perspective, from humanity? Are they properly acculturated to understand the communities that they're going into? And see, the answer to that is no. So already, just in the very way that we train and acculturate officers, we're setting up sort of the foundation for the us-them perspective that exists as a cultural fact in a closed paramilitary type of environment. So we're making it hard right there. You almost have to be a hero. You have to be engaged in overcoming just from that simple foundational fact. And then on the back end of it, do we make it safe to actually do the right thing and report in a way that is not going to put you and your career and your family at risk? And the answer historically has been no. And one of the things that was recommended by both the task force and the Justice Department was the creation of a portal, a reporting portal that would allow for the anonymous reporting of misconduct or other suggestions about how the department can improve a safe space for officers to do the right thing without having to be a hero. So acting on those recommendations, our office created exactly that. A portal for employees of the police department. It is a double-blind system utilizing the same sorts of technology and structure that is done, that allows you to use your iPhone to pay for things, that protects your passwords. It's a double-blind system that allows for anonymously submitting complaints. That went live in November of last year. There are 15,000 employees of the Chicago Police Department. 21 have entered and used that portal. That means the department itself has yet to commit itself to exactly both that foundational platform and that valuing of safe space for officers to do the right thing. There's a lot that we can do that makes it so that officers don't have to be heroes to do the right thing. I will say, my view, officers want to do the right thing. But when we have doing the right thing be something that puts them at risk of their careers, their jobs, their obligations to their family, we are disserving them.
Yeah, I also can't answer the question directly, but again, from the perspective of, you know, working in the neighborhood, living in neighborhoods, I think that we also forget that police officers are our neighbors, right? And on 63rd and Rockwell, where my office is, we need the police. And we have to find a way to have a relationship with the police. And it has to go both ways. Every now and then we do ride-alongs. It's a quick, funny story. So I'm doing a ride-along with someone high up in the police department. We drive around the west side. We stop to go to lunch. Spend a half a day now. We sit down finally. I say, "Whew, how's your adrenaline feeling right now?" He says, "We haven't done anything. We've just been riding around in the car." I said, "Man, my heart is beating so fast." He was like, "What?" Like, seriously, we haven't done anything. But what it is, every single person on the street stares at that police car that goes by, at least in the neighborhoods I was in. I don't know if it happens downtown. And so it really does become a us versus them, even though this police officer may be my neighbor, right? And so again, I think that if we're talking about civil society, we have to get to a place where there's a place for law enforcement. I have a true life story where I really feel like the police officer saved my life when I was a teenager. And I had a friend who died. That police officer is necessary in our community, but not as an occupying force in the community, right? It has to be a system in which we all work together to have that civil society that works.
I'm reminded by Gina's remarks of just a simple formulation of a friend who for a period was a deputy commissioner in New York in the police department. And she said, in a democracy, there's nothing as good as a good police officer, and there's nothing as bad as a bad police officer. And I think it's important to you know, retain both sides of that equation and how we talk about these things. And I think we've been in a period where it's been hard to do that.
Other questions in the far back there, and then we'll get to you in the corner later, or maybe we're going there now. we'll reverse it then.
Hi, my name is Dan Weinberg. I'm with Equip for Equality. I've heard a lot today about trust in the community. We've heard about COPA, IA, the OIG, every kind of way we can kind of create this accountability, this transparency, this trust in the community. And what was missing from the consent decree you were all asked and answered. And I've not heard anything about CPAC or any potential for grassroots solutions to creating trust in the community, what organizations in the community would like to see, organizations that have been directly affected by police violence and brutality, like Black Lives Matter, BYP 100, all those organizations coming out in support of CPAC. So what are your opinions on that?
So in setting out the landscape, the organizational and institutional landscape, there is a giant piece that's missing, stated as a required element at the front end that is part of sort of the standard machinery around the country and other cities that have gone through this, and that is a community-based platform, a community commission. And there's lots and lots of discussion and argument to have about the scope of authority and what it's constituted of. But in Chicago, it's critically important for this reason. There is one element in oversight and accountability that is not in the game, has not been in the game historically, that we'd all be better served if it was in the game, and that is the city council, the city of Chicago. Legislative oversight is very, very important. And that has been missing in a huge way in all of this when Jamie talks about what are the institutional sort of conditions that allow for this moment to have evolved. That's one of them. And even amidst this period of sort of groping and moving towards a new order, a new paradigm, it's still unclear whether or not the legislative oversight piece is actually going to be actively engaged, which is exactly why it is critically important that there be an independent, standalone, community-based commission, regardless of its scope of authority, if only for the reason of assuring that the perspective and the voice of the community actually has a platform from which to receive the input and to project from an institutionally established place that voice and that perspective on everything that's going on. It's critically missing. The consent decree, the draft, the ultimate form of the consent decree will provide for its existence, but what it is something that is being debated behind closed doors right now. It needs to be resolved because in the absence of it, you're exactly right. There actually isn't a medium for the development of legitimacy and trust because there is no place that the community knows that it can actually bring its perspective and introduce it into this organizational landscape.
I'm absolutely open to community impact. I think that the execution of it is kind of one of the big things that we have to look at. In looking at the entire process as it is right now, I mean, I can say from my perspective, I've never spoken with anyone from CPAC. I've gone to the hearings, so I don't know, maybe the CPAC group or GAPA or some of the other groups understand the police board process, but we haven't been a part of that conversation. And so I think to make sure that we're getting the most out of it, that we should all understand those processes. And so I'm open for whatever kinds of changes we're going to make. I hope that we'll all be clear in really understanding what those processes are completely before we make a decision on how to fix some problems.
Another question back there?
Hi, my name is Pete Kalenic. So from my understanding, we're at the 10th annual discussion on police accountability. And we've talked about the evolution that the city's had with respect to COBRA, or IPRA going to COBRA. We've talked about the consent decree. And then we've also identified some things that are currently missing with respect to the city council being involved and the community being involved. So with all that being said, what does a win for police accountability even look like? We identified two things that are missing. But are we going to continue to have this conversation 10 years from now? What systems structurally are we lacking? And in your individual opinions in each of your roles, right? Where can we get to the point where the public is satisfied with the state of police accountability?
Full disclosure up front, I know Pete. He was a law student of mine at Loyola. Great question, Pete. Look, the structures, the mechanisms, that's not the measure of reform. We're going to argue about those structures and mechanisms, their relationship for a while, how it is that we monitor, things, what sorts of operational and programmatic reforms that are instituted. What's different about this time, I think, and this is where the monitor actually comes into play, is the only measure is actual outcomes as it relates to constitutional policing, accountability for constitutional policing, in a way that fosters improved law enforcement outcomes. Those improved law enforcement outcomes necessarily involve relationship between the community and the police department that will not occur without the fostering of legitimacy and trust. And so it's the outcomes, it's not the systems that we're creating in the meantime, which is why transparency is really important. All of this kind of needs to be out in the public square, because ultimately it has to be the public that decides that this is actually happening this time.
Yeah, I completely agree with Joe's remarks. I would also say that it is important to acknowledge substantial progress that has been made. And you know, there's a sense in which this whole process has been like swimming across a big body of water, and you get to a point where you can't see either shore. You know, you don't have coordinates, and it's hard to assess where we are in the process. Fairly extraordinary things have happened. I mean, the level of transparency that we now have, even though we're pushing for more, and you know, as we've said, a paradigm shift in how we think about transparency, 4 years ago would have been all but inconceivable. You know, COPA is still getting on its feet, but making a serious effort, and you know, wish them well in terms of more rigorous, competent investigations of individual complaints. Recall Joe's description of the unit within the Office of the Inspector General that Joey is now taking leadership of. Extraordinary. The data portal that the Inspector General is going to go live with in a couple of weeks. So, you know, there's a danger if we don't acknowledge progress, even with a sense of crisis and urgency. There's a danger if we don't acknowledge progress of a kind of civic demoralization, which I think is a significant danger, you know, of just people feeling like it's too intractable. You know, and if you juxtapose either face-to-face conversations or reporting from the neighborhoods most affected, where people, you know, feel unheard and like their reality is not being acknowledged, you juxtapose that with the reports or direct conversations with officers about their sense of being kind of marooned, and you know, it's an image of intractability on both sides. That becomes a danger in itself, a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, when people can't imagine things being different or better. So I do think it's important, in response to the question you just asked, that we can, you know, remain impatient, pushing for more, sharpening the diagnosis of what is wrong, but keep visible things that have been accomplished.
I'm going to answer the question in a different kind of way. I went to business school, you guys went to law school. I took one class in law school, and I took it pass-fail, and honestly thought I was going to fail it. I was an investment banker, and the deal sizes that I closed were $2 billion, $3 billion, big deals. And I was on the deal side, and I want to go close the next deal. And I got put on this team for something called Six Sigma. Oh my God, another meeting on my calendar is stopping me from wanting to go get these deals. It was a year-long process, most boring meetings you ever had to sit in. But we had to look at a process from start, the very start of the process to the very finish of the process. I mean, little minute details, I'm pulling my hair out. We ended up getting something like some efficiency that created something like $30 million by making sure that our database had the right address. Just simply not from things coming back returned to sender because we had the wrong address. So I'm going to answer the question by saying, I think we should look at the entire process from the beginning of, when you're a kid in the neighborhood, how do you relate to police officers, right? When you're determining if you want to be a police officer, the testing, the application for police officers, the training, all the way through the disciplinary process. And I just, maybe that's happening, I'm not sure. But to me, I think we should look at the entire process. Let's not just pick pieces of it that's broken, but let's start and let's come up with, as much as I hate mosquitoes, if we found a way to eradicate mosquitoes, it might throw off the ecosystem. I don't know. And so you have to look at the whole process.
either in back or right here. Pat, you've got it.
Oh,
Yep.
sorry, I don't need the mic. I'm loud. My name's Andrea Lyon, and I'm a criminal defense lawyer. No one's ever said that before. And I'm a criminal defense lawyer, and I've spent a lot of time in courtrooms with police officers and et cetera. And one of the things that is complained about a lot is the mental health challenges to our police officers having to deal with people with mental health problems. I don't think we pay anywhere near enough attention to the mental health problems that they have either, of secondary trauma. And I'm not sure that we should have anybody on the street for 20 years. We would not put a soldier on the front lines for 20 years. We know he or she would have PTSD. We know that for a fact. We do not have a system in which we allow people to calm the hell down. You know, I mean, as a member of the, I was in the homicide division of the public defender's office trying death cases all the time. And I'm going to tell you, secondary trauma is a real thing. And so when you're talking, and I appreciate you talking about starting at the beginning, one of the things at the beginning is that we have to figure out a way to make it possible for someone to express empathy and get positive feedback for that, not for being, you know, 3 strikes you're out, I'm a tough guy, you know, I won't use the language, but anyway. And so I'm just wondering, in all of this police accountability things that we're talking about, is anyone talking about thinking about changing how we have people on the street?
Yes. The answer to your question is yes, and it's a really important underlying question to ultimately whether or not we're going to achieve the sorts of success that we all know we need to achieve. So there's PTSD on both sides. If you are a child who grows up in Inglewood, you have been exposed to violence directly and indirectly to an extraordinary degree. And I think there's been some studies done, but upwards of 3/4 of children who grow up in, say, Inglewood or Austin show signs of some form of PTSD. Okay, so we're traumatized on one side. You're bringing up an extraordinarily seldom mentioned topic of the trauma on the other side. The warrior culture and mentality sort of disfavors requests and calls for help, disfavors the identification of those signals of an officer experiencing stress of some sort. And that's not just the stress from the job, it's the stress from life itself. But since the officer carries a firearm and may potentially use that, those external stressors are really important to be identifying. So among the things that are actually part of the consent decree, among the things that are being worked on right now, and these are all interconnected and they all have to be functioning to be successful. Employee assistance program within the police department. So there are over 13,000 sworn officers right now. The employee assistance division of the police department until recently had 2 mental health trained professionals. 2. It has 4 now. Compared to national best practices, that's nothing. It doesn't even meet sort of the passive self-reporting needs of the department. Going back to sort of that issue of whether we've created structures that render it safe to actually identify a fellow officer or for that officer to actually seek help, the answer is no. Culturally, there is it is disfavored. There is fear that if you actually go and speak to a counselor, you may find yourself losing your firearm, your right to carry a firearm, which is, from the perspective of a police officer, basically is the end of their career. We do not train sergeants, frontline supervisors, lieutenants to actually identify those indicia of stress. Officers need support, they need evaluation. We have a substandard system in that regard. It is an important component of the consent decree and of what is being worked towards, but without it, you're absolutely right. We're not going to actually get to the place of success.
Other questions back there in the far back?
Hi, I'm Mara Clavan. I'm the staff attorney at BPI. My question is, because it seems that so much of the efficacy of the consent decree will come down to implementation, what qualities or qualifications would you like to see from the monitoring team?
The monitoring team should have expertise, should be comprised of a team that has the expertise in all of these realms that we've been talking about and more. There can't be one area favored over another, or one area favored to the detriment of another. So we need to have people on the team, for instance, who are mental health experts, who are mental health experts in law enforcement, who are organizational experts, who actually understand what it means to have a supervisory system with accountability, who are experts in actual training of law enforcement officers, who are experts in the actual setting up of management structures for law enforcement organizations, who are experts, have some expertise in crime strategy. You would think, why is it that a consent monitor would need to have any expertise in crime strategy? Because you need to have somebody that actually understands what the CPD's primary objectives are and how it is that they're going to need to go about it. And you're also going to have some people who know Lean Six Sigma, because part of what we're talking about overall is a government agency that, from a management perspective, is not where it needs to be, doesn't have sufficient controls, doesn't have sufficient standards in place. You're going to need people with expertise in large set data analysis, going to have some expertise in utilizing doing large data set analysis with respect to disparate outcomes as it relates to certain classes of individuals within society. It's an enormously complex undertaking that we're entering into here. And if the consent monitor does not have a team that has expertise in all of the requisite realms, we're going to drop one of the balls here. And if we drop one of the balls, there's potential consequences with respect to the other balls that we think we actually have in the air properly.
I would add one other criteria. This is a wish list, that the monitor, that he or she be someone who can tell the story of reform. You know, I mean, there's the complexity of the undertaking, but I think one of the failures of the leadership in the city to date has been to tell the story of reform. I always draw a parallel to Selma and Dr. King. You know, Dr. King was brilliant at dramatizing and telling the story of reform. But what was Selma really about? It was about the Voting Rights Act. It was about something as legislation that was as granular as police reform. I think it's been hard for people it can be very daunting to hear all the complexity of the consent decree, the complexity, all the moving parts of reform. So I think, you know, ideally we also have someone, at least the face of the monitor team, who can sort of project that kind of leadership. This is also, forgive me as a writer for pointing out, a kind of narrative process. We need to be able to see ourselves inside this story as it unfolds. So far, that has been a real deficiency of leadership. Maybe the monitor will be able to provide that.
I would just add that I would hope that we have a monitor or their team who has a good historical understanding of Chicago. I think we have such little quirks about us here that if you don't have that historical context, it's going to be hard to come up with some solutions and monitor solutions that actually work. Just a personal example, my wife is from New York. We moved here, oh, let's buy a house. So I'm going to work every day, she's looking for the house. She's like, found the perfect house, 33rd and Morgan. I'm just going to make it up. I'm like, that's Bridgeport. Are you kidding me? There's no way in the world we can move to Bridgeport. She's like, why not? That's Chicago, right? And so without, now, she was right, actually. I could have moved to Bridgeport. It's way more diverse than when I was a kid, right? But at Greater Southwest, when he called me to interview me to be the executive director, this is Chicago Lawn. I said, you guys do know I'm black, right? They said, oh, the neighborhood changed, don't worry about that. When I was a kid, I was banned from going to both of those neighborhoods. We could go to the White Sox game and get right back across the Dan Ryan. That was the option. So unless somebody understands that, I think it's going to be hard to put some things in place.
I see that we are well beyond our time limit, so I want to thank Latham and Watkins again, and especially our speakers. The program has to be over because our time is up, so I'm thanking the speakers.